Benjamin L. Hooks Institute is proud and pleased to present this online discussion on the importance of critical race theory, CRT in academic education and activist studies. The event, as we know now, is being live streamed on our many different platforms, and we encourage you to click the share button. If you're watching right now on our Facebook page, click the share button and let others know that we are live talking about CRT, critical race theory, what it is and what it isn't. CRT is invaluable in how it helps us understand, research, study, and teach how race functions in the United States and across the globe. However, much of this have come under attack as opponents of CRT charge that it divides Americans and promotes a distorted view of American history, a racial and ideological lens. In response to these attacks on CRT, the panelists tonight will address those concerns and help us unpack what CRT is and why it has been and continues to be an essential tool in addressing our racist past and present. I am pleased that we have four distinguished people here that are well equipped to do just that. First up is Dr. Camille Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an interculturalist, scholar, and language advocate. Originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dr. Anderson has always kept a tight grip on her passion and compassion for others and difference through language. Her primary focus is family empowerment through language with an emphasis on application and confidence. Dr. Anderson received her PhD in intercultural communication from the Howard University in 2007. She received a BA in Spanish from Spelman College and an MA in International Communication and Cultural Anthropology from American University. She has been teaching in higher education since 2005. She has taught a wide range of courses in higher education, including public speaking, interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, human communication, media, culture, and society, small group communication, international communication, business communication, as well as faculty-led student travel courses. Dr. Wallace C. Baxter III. Dr. Baxter is a native of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and grew up in Marietta, Georgia. After attending Morehouse for his BA degree and Duke Divinity School for his MDiv, Dr. Baxter completed his PhD in African American literature at Howard University. Dr. Baxter currently teaches African American literature at Gettysburg College. He is the author of the forthcoming publication, You Must Be Born Again, Phyllis Wheatley as Prophetic Poet, from Lexington Books later this year. In addition, he is co-editing a 2-volume series of sermons entitled Preaching During a Pandemic, The Rhetoric of the Black Preaching Tradition, with Peter Lane, coming out in 2022. Our third panelist, Dr. Latrice Donaldson. Dr. Donaldson is an assistant professor of history in the Applied Social Science Department at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. She earned her PhD in African American history from the University of Memphis and her BA and MA from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Her research centers on the lives of African Americans in the military and how gender and masculinity help reshape and shape the narrative of the Black military experience. And finally, Daniel Keel. Daniel Keel is a professor of law at the Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law, where he joined the faculty in 2008 and teaches constitutional law, education and civil rights, and property law. In addition to his record of publications focusing on the disparities in education, Professor Keel is the director of the Memphis 13, 2011, a documentary sharing the stories of the first graders who desegregated Memphis City schools back in 1961. The film has been screened at universities, film festivals, museums, and schools across the country, and was made possible in part by a research grant from, yes, the Hooks Institute back in 2010. Professor Keel has been recognized on campus with the university's Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Award and the Alumni Association Distinguished Teaching Award, as well as various honors within the law school. He has served on the Hooks Institute National Book Award Committee since 2012 and has contributed a paper to the Institute's 2018 policy paper series. Professor Keel is a native Memphian and a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and Harvard Law School. As you can see, we have a distinguished and robust panel. We are looking for a robust discussion on tonight. Opening us up is Dr. Camille Anderson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, and thank you again to the Hooks Institute for allowing us to even have this discussion. As Dr. Johnson said, my name is Dr. Camille Anderson. I am currently residing in Ohio, and I'm about to kick us off with this conversation around critical race theory. I am operating from Kimberly Crenshaw's explanation of critical race theory, where she explains that CRT acknowledges the legacy of slavery, segregation, and imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color that continues to permeate the social fabric of this nation. So with that understanding of where I'm operating from, I want to address a particular aspect when it comes to CRT. So I'm going to talk about LangCrit, or critical language and race theory. It's a critical theory of language and race that challenges fixed assumptions related to categories such as language, identity, and race, and argues that these categories are socially and locally constructed. Specifically, it is a theoretical and analytical framework which puts the intersection of subject as heard and the subject as seen at the forefront of any type of interpretation and analysis. So it looks for ways in which race, racism, racialization intersect with issues of language, belonging, and identity. I want to speak directly to this influx of the governor's signing of new bills, because the work that I do in CRT is in the classroom, most specifically in the foreign language classroom, using an Afrocentric derivation of LangCrit. So if we look at the Tennessee bill, for example, it will restrict what public school teachers can discuss in Tennessee classrooms about racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias. And this actually limits the authentic identity for the racialized child in the classroom. So I want to talk about two quotes from James Baldwin, because I love him, one, and two, I think they're appropriate for our discussion. So the first quote I have from James Baldwin is, "The purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself to make his own decisions. If we restrict conversations about racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias, what tools are we giving Black children especially to make their own decisions?" That's the first quote. The second quote is, "A child cannot be taught by anyone who despises them." So we're now shifting this locus of control when it comes to our personal narrative back to white supremacy with these audacious moves by these local governments. And I'm saying this boldly and without apology because my research examines how the presence of Black culture, history, and identity are critical for language retention in the foreign language classroom. In particular, I use racial linguistics to examine how language is used to construct race and how ideas of race influence language and language use. So Rosa and Flores talk about racial linguistics as part of a broader structural project of contesting white supremacy. So from an Afrocentric perspective, studying racial linguistics would examine not only the impact of race on foreign language learning, but also the influence of race in foreign language retention. Racial linguistics can be applied to the study of Blacks in foreign language learning because of the hegemonic presentation of language within the classroom, as well as the hegemonic presentation of language outside of the classroom. It not only allows one to approximate race and culture in the classroom, but also challenges the examination of how race plays a factor in language acquisition and retention. It is this intentional act that brings social and racial justice into the foreign language classroom in particular. By restricting CRT, this work can't be completed. If you insist that race no longer be a prominent factor, I'm no longer allowed to question its absence in the foreign language classroom. Part of the reason why CRT is a threat is because of the lack of acknowledgement of the research as it relates to Black children in education. using a common proverb as an analogy, CRT is giving the lion an opportunity to share its side of the story. And we have now chosen to rewrite the narrative back in favor of the hunter because we're too uncomfortable to evaluate our role in the lion's pain. So being able to see the authentic representation of race and culture that are relatable for the student, particularly the Black student, is what Brown and Edward call an untapped intellectual resource. By allowing students to identify similar racial and linguistic features in course content, students are able to witness perceived authenticity of language. This can't be adequately tested without methods in CRT. Language activism examines the structures of privilege and power exacerbated through supremacy of language. It attaches language to contestations of power and critiques standard forms as codes of power. So specifically, in the foreign language classroom, it perpetuates supremacist elitism of foreign language learning among monolinguals who are seeking access in bilingual education. It makes clear hierarchical distinctions between English language learners in bilingual education and monolingual students seeking to learn another language in bilingual education, which sounds really confusing, but basically what we do in bilingual education to help those who have English as a second language versus what we do in bilingual education for those who just want to learn the language. And it continues to situate supremacist notions by placing new demands on racialized groups to modify their behaviors around language. And seeking to further an Afrocentric language activism, I can focus and center the Black student in languages and focus on the Africanisms that are present in language and analyze how the appearance of Africanness affects our listening to language. This can't happen without CRT methods and analysis. So there's this assumption that the presence of students of color in the classroom and carefully placed non-threatening images of well-known people of color as decoration in the classroom in the school is adequate in ensuring that Black students in particular see their identity represented. However, it can be argued this representation is shallow at best and continues to exacerbate issues of white supremacy within the education system. Shallow will not move our people. We are deeply profound, deeply critical, and deeply connected to an ancestral history with multilingualism. Limiting discussions around this can cripple our beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Dr. Wallace Baxter.
Great, great, great. I am so excited to be in on this conversation, and I'm grateful to share this platform with this panel, this virtual panel with you all. Critical race theory. Yeah, critical race theory. I deal with it for the most part from the lens or the vantage point of a pulpit theologian. I serve as a pastor as well as a professor, and so I see it in the classroom and I teach it in the classroom, but I also teach it in the church. And I believe that it is so vitally important because it helps us understand really what it means to be in this nation. Really what it means to be in this nation. It is a kind of a theoretical approach that helps us define, redefine, and uncover some things about race and racism in America. Particularly what I've done in the church is to teach a class entitled Stop the Madness, Race, Religion, and Politics, and really talk about critical race theory, what it means, the various things, ordinariness, interest convergence, all dealing with some of Kimberly Crenshaw's work as well, and as well as Derek Bell, and looking at all of that and differential racialization and all of those things. And one of the things that we use, particularly as we engage critical race theory and what it means, is this whole idea of voice of color thesis that basically, you represent the race, right? Many of those that I encounter, both in the classroom that look like me, as well as in the church, they tend to find themselves as one of the few in certain spaces, whether it's on the job or in the community, whatever it is. And there's an expectation almost that they can speak for the race. Of course, we know the problems that lie with that. I remember Anna Julia Cooper, she said, who knows, when and where I enter, the entire Negro race enters with me. That's a different concept than the assumption, right, that you as a Black person, speaks for the entirety of the Black race. That's not the same thing that Cooper was saying, but it's something that is assumed about us. And so as we look at this idea of critical race theory, what it means and how it affects us today is so vitally important, because our people have to be able to understand how they are being viewed, perceived from those who are looking at them. It's, of course, Du Bois's whole notion of double consciousness and what it means to know who you are, but at the same time, know how others view you. And it's a dangerous thing when you try to strip away a mechanism, a vehicle that helps people come to a place of self-actualization. Because if you strip it, then we're no longer able, in theory, to attain that level of self-actualization, know who we really are. And so we go through life not really fully understanding who we are, and not fully understanding how we are placed, right, in the world historically. I was explaining to a friend of mine not long ago that critical race theory is not so much about trying to point out who a racist is. He's a racist, she's a racist, this, that, the other. No, critical race theory is a theoretical frame of reference for us to dig into the reality of race in America. It's just something that is real. It's in the fabric, woven into the fabric of America, of who America is, what America is about, and there's no way to escape that. And so I'm a firm believer that critical race theory is something that must be taught, should be taught. As a young man that grew up largely in white schools, white communities, where critical race theory, of course, was not taught, and really where you really just got a February's worth of Black history in general. The reality is that if it wasn't for a mother who was an educator and a father who was an educator as well, then I would not be able to know who I was prior to going to college. Granted, I went to college and it was reinforced consistently because I went to an HBCU, but that should not have to be the case. It's something that I believe is so vitally important, and particularly in the church, as it relates to the church. I realized how much the folks that I engage on a weekly basis need it, because as we were digging into it and talking about several things, the light bulb went off in many of their heads, and many of them 70 years old, 60 years old. They've been around for a while, yet they had not thought about race in this way. They had not looked at it objectively to see exactly what's going on the ground. And once they saw it, it automatically harkened them back to experiences they had in life. And so for me, for the church, and some of the research that I do when I talk about how critical race theory affects the church on the ground, our ecclesiology, I really look at this idea of the testimonial and how critical race theory can actually unlock some doors to new testimony from those who have been in church for a long time, grew up in church, but never really engaged race in this way, never really engaged personhood in this way, never really engaged othering and all of these things in this way. And so I really have seen the fruit of it. And I believe that's something that must be taught, should be taught, and should be sustained. It is sustainable because it is real life. It is us. It is what this nation really has to deal with and wrestle with. And for far too long, we have, particularly politically, been afraid to tackle the hard issues, the real issues in life. And so my hope is that we will do that, and that there will be those that will push for that, all from the top down, from the highest levels of Congress, all the way down to the school boards, on and on to the individual classrooms. It's so vitally important.
Thank you, Dr. Baxter. Next up, Dr. Latrice Donaldson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I first want to thank everyone for the possibility to present on this panel. I'm going to look at this from the historical perspective in that, so this past weekend, we just celebrated Juneteenth, which was just made a federal holiday, right? The importance of critical race theory in that when we think about Juneteenth, right? The way that many of the Republican legislatures and governors have been attacking it, people would not understand why you're celebrating Juneteenth, right? So, for example, in Texas, the 1836 Project, in which all students in Texas have to take the history of Texas as a course, right? And the way that it is presented as a very anglicized version of this historical event in regards to Texas getting its independence from Mexico. And so the teachers from K through 12 are not allowed to talk about the fact that Mexico, when it issued its demands to the citizens of Texas, stating that they are required to abolish slavery because Mexico, when it gained independence from Spain, abolished slavery. And so one of the reasons why Texas rebelled against Mexico was for the preservation of slavery. However, if you're a student in the state of Texas and you go through the history of Texas, you're not going to be taught about the real reason as to why, one of the reasons why the Austins rejected the offer made by the Mexican government. And it's going to be a, how can I put this? It's going to be a huge disadvantage, right? The fact is that when we look at critical race theory and the way that people are attacking critical race theory, the fact is that no one who's teaching between the grades of K through 12 is actually teaching critical race theory. There is no third grade teacher teaching critical race theory, right? However, the language that is being used within the legislation is directed towards presenting this very anglicized, whitewashed version of American history, right? In that race is not a factor in the founding of this country. And when we think about the importance of critical race theory in the larger perspective of its relation to interdisciplinary studies, right? You look at the social construction of race, right? Race is a social construction. And if you teach that, people will say that, oh, you're teaching critical race theory or whatnot. But the fact is that looking at the language from critical race theory is very important to understand that race was something that was created to help perpetuate the systemic oppression of people of color in the United States. The problem that that is stemming from all of this, when you look at Donald Trump's 1776 commission, in which they are trying to argue for this idea that, you're trying to make American history something that people shouldn't be proud of. Well, the fact is that American history is founded on the oppression of indigenous people, in the oppression of poor people coming from Europe and whatnot in regards to indentured servitude, and with the oppression of enslaved Africans when they arrived in this country in slave ships. So the fact is that the U.S. is literally built on these pillars of oppression. That's the truth. The idea that CRT is somehow going to try to make people not proud of being American is a disservice to these people in regards to them understanding that you're being taught a lie, right? As a history professor, it is frustrating because when they come to college, there is no legislation about regulating what college professors can teach about race and racism and in regards to critical race theory and whatnot. And so when the students come to my classroom, they are unprepared for the truth that I'm going to tell them about American history, right? That, Thomas Jefferson, when he died, his estate sold 200 and some odd plus individuals into servitude, or that George Washington wore dentures made from human teeth, which were taken from enslaved individuals, right? So when we think about the importance of, it's just, they use it as some kind of catch-all in regards to teaching about anti-racism. But they can't criticize anti-racism because that would come across as racist. But they can go after something that is more than likely or not taught. You're not going to learn about critical race theory when you're in the 3rd grade or the 5th grade or the 10th grade AP US history. But you'll learn about it when you're a senior or a junior or a graduate student in college. But what they're attacking is the type of education that you're being taught in regards to learning about the truth of American history, right? And they want to teach this very structured historical amnesia to students so that they don't know and don't really grasp the gravity and the legacy of this oppression of systemic racism. That, think about this, right? Harriet Tubman, when you think about Harriet Tubman, you think, slavery was so long ago. But think about this. When Harriet Tubman was born and Harriet Tubman died, Ronald Reagan was alive when Harriet Tubman died, okay? And Thomas Jefferson was alive when Harriet Tubman was born, right? So when you think about the legacy of slavery in regards to the chronology of it and the effects of it, because everyone always likes to say, well, that was so long ago. But I'm like, if you think about that, Ronald Reagan was president in the 80s. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, was president in the early 1800s. So Harriet Tubman was alive through a very long lifespan in which presidents were alive when I was alive, right? When I was born, was alive when Harriet Tubman was alive. And the legacy of the fact that this enslaved individual, this person who fought to liberate other enslaved individuals, was alive when a US president who was president in the 20th century was alive. And so oftentimes when you think about the long-term legacy of oppression, and one of the things that comes out of critical race theory is because it's directly tied to legal studies in regards to the racial implications of systemic oppression of people of color, and particularly African Americans, is directly tied to this legacy in regards to enslavement. So you think about the largest penitentiary in the United States. The largest penitentiary in the United States is on the same soil and ground that was a plantation in Louisiana, right? And over 75% of that population who are serving life sentences are African Americans. Now, that is what critical race theory is teaching and attempting to dismantle, right? The fact that why would you build a penitentiary on the same soil of a plantation and you systemically oppress and arrest and put people of African descent in that penitentiary? And what that means psychologically to a population in the United States. So when thinking about critical race theory from the historical perspective, it's very important, especially as someone who studies African American history. And so anyone who studies American history, right? You can't separate race from the founding of this country. It's not possible, right? They make it it's a very important factor in the Constitution of this country. Because up until the abolishment of slavery, people of African of descent were considered not citizens or 3/4 of a person. So, this is why it's important to really grasp what they're attempting to do, to completely whitewash American history into making, George Washington is the guy who wouldn't lie and went and chopped down a cherry tree, and Thomas Jefferson is this great lover of freedom, versus the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a racist who owned other human beings. And we don't even want to talk about his relationship with Sally Hemings, which is very, very complicated and disgusting. All right, so with that being said, I'll stop and turn it back over to the moderator, and we can, go to questions.
All right, thanks, Dr. Donaldson. And next up, Daniel Keith.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and to the Hooks Institute for organizing this. Thrilled to be here, and it's of course difficult to go last because everyone else has already shared so much of the context here. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to kind of try to demystify this topic, because in recent months it's become such a part of local and national conversations, but as so often occurs when topics that aren't really talked about for 40 years in national conversations all of a sudden blow up to cable news channels, they get reduced to caricature and distortion. So I'm going to try to provide some thoughts on what is, I think, a much more complex topic, as certainly evidenced by Dr. Anderson, Dr. Donaldson, Dr. Baxter. It's a much more complex topic than I think is apparent from the discussion, not just on the news, but even in some of our legislatures. So I just wanted to note a couple of things. One, that the origins of what we are describing today, critical race theory, come in a broader movement that sort of starts in law schools in the 1970s. Critical legal studies is sort of the beginning point of a lot of this, at least the formalized version of it, right? There's certainly scholars and thinkers going back decades, centuries, that are critiquing law in this way. But that the word critique is really important here, because that's what became formalized as critical legal studies, and also sort of in parallel critical race theory, as a critique of law, and as law not being this neutral, impartial tool where these universal values are applied dispassionately and lead to justice, right? Its aim was to demystify that idealized version of law, and suggest that if it's not that, it might have, and in many cases has, the effect of law being simply the codification, the sort of bringing to statute of existing power structures. Okay, and these existing power structures that are supported now by law can help maintain status quo and maintain power structures. And this, obviously, today we're talking about critical race theory, but this movement is not solely about race. So if you think of a critique of marriage laws that would not allow married women to own property, that is a codification of law to maintain existing power structures within a marriage. Even things like bankruptcy laws might exist in a way that favors creditors, the sort of lenders of money, over debtors, the borrowers of money, and maintain the sort of existing power structures there. But while it wasn't only about race, it certainly is about race, and some obvious examples of the codification of existing power structures is slavery, right? The laws protected slavery. Our Constitution protects the slave trade, at least temporarily. There's all sorts of legal protections in our country for the rights of holders of human property, and no legal protection for those who had been enslaved. And so the idea was that we should have this critique of law, not as this sort of impartial system of justice, but as at least arguably representing these codification of power structures. And so it's unfolding in the 70s, and critical race theory is certainly a part of this. And the critical race theory portion of it is triggered in part because in the 70s and in the decades, the 20 years prior to the 70s, there is a reckoning in American law that's been forced by the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is forcing us to reckon with law in ways that we haven't had to as a country since Reconstruction. And, long overdue reckoning, but that was when it was happening. And so, the sort of process that, if we want to lay out the process, we have an era of official discrimination where the government is clearly protecting oppression and discrimination. And then we have some sort of removal of the legality of that, right? So an official rejection. And so in my work, I would certainly point to Brown versus Board of Education as a really important moment where the official embrace of discrimination was removed. But that official rejection didn't make the disparities that had been caused by the official discrimination go away. It just sort of removed the legalization of it. And so what sometimes follows, although not always, is the government, the law, sort of stepping in to remedy the effects of that official discrimination that's now been rejected. And those efforts look like anti-discrimination laws, right? In hiring or in housing, in other kinds of ways that say you can't make a decision based on race or gender or disability status or insert anti-discrimination language. The other way you might do it, in addition to an anti-discrimination law, is for the government to actually step in and push for remedial action. So this might be aid at its, it could be something like reparations. It could be policy change that sort of looks at structures that have been built in laws that are systematically disadvantaging members of a group and say, we're not going to follow those policies anymore. We're going to reverse those policies or something like that. And it's those remedial efforts that I wanted to sort of focus in on with regard to critical race theory, because it's those efforts that I think explain the timing in the 1970s of sort of critical race theory's birth as a movement here. So these remedial efforts, aid, policy change, they lead to pushback, and the pushback often takes the language of no, remedial effort is reverse discrimination or special treatment or special privileges or favoritism, special rights. And what that argument is claiming is that simply removing the official discrimination is enough. And the reason you would want to do that is because you would like to undermine the arguments that allow for governments or those with power, really, to, I'm thinking today of, corporate statements that are sort of bolder, perhaps, than government statements have been. So undermining the arguments of those with power to take genuine remedial action. And that argument, of special treatment, which I think we sort of hearing echoes of in the discussion of critical race theory today, it sort of makes it like, and the word we might use is post-racialism. It argues that we're actually in a post-racial world where, since we've removed the barriers, everything is now equal and opportunities are now equal. Disparities, if they continue to exist, are not systemic, but they're due to individual worthiness. That's the argument of post-racialism. And this argument absolves society of responsibility and undermines these arguments for society to take these remedial actions. And what critical race theory does is offers a counter to that. So the 1970s is an era where post-racialism is sort of having a boom, right? We've had 20 years since Brown versus Board of Education, and a lot of Americans are ready to sort of move on and stop talking about race. And so post-racialism is out there, and critical race theory steps in as this counter narrative to say, no, we can't absolve society of responsibility yet. Why? Because it isn't neutral, impartial applications of universal measures of merit that is leading to the disparities of today, but rather it's the effects of torn down structures and the perpetuation of existing structures that are continuing to lead to disadvantage for members of marginalized groups. It's this codification or the failure to undo old codification of official discrimination, right? And so what critical race theory sought to do at that time was to sort of rescue the need for official remedial action. So the question might be, why is it happening today? And I think it's because in the last year, we've seen new momentum for genuine remedial action by those in power, corporations, governments, local governments, et cetera, in the aftermath of George Floyd. And rather than confronting that remedial action directly, although I think that's happening as well, there has been this attack on its rationale, which is partly critical race theory, right? So if you say that it's structures that are the reason that we need remedial action, then confronting that rationale is a way of undermining the momentum that I think has been building in the year since George Floyd's murder. And so that is mostly about what is critical race theory. I have some other thoughts on what today's resistance to critical race theory is and what it isn't, but I'll hold on to that and turn it back over to Dr. Johnson, our moderator.
Right, thank you. We just heard 4 wonderful presentations, exhortations, I might add, about critical race theory from 4 different perspectives. And we have several questions already coming from our viewers. So I'm going to just dive right on in. And I think, let me just start off by asking the first one here that I think anyone can be addressed to any one of the panelists. One of our viewers is concerned, of course, by talking, I guess, preaching to the choir, talking amongst ourselves. And so the question is, how do we reach a larger audience to talk about critical race theory, to give information about critical race theory, especially to people who really, really want to know? Now, I would think that what we're doing tonight is a good start, being Facebook Live, not knowing who's going to, watch it. And even when we are finished, this will be up on our page and people can go back and watch it and share it with other folk. But what say you? How can we, and that's a typical question, how can we just move beyond the folk that already agree with us to go out and share this with others?
I guess I'll start. One suggestion that I think I would have is just allow us to talk about it more. With what it is that we're doing in terms of the restrictions around what we can talk about and what we can't talk about, it limits our ability to be able to have these discussions, these conversations. Part of activist scholarship is allowing us to be able to take what we're reading, take these scholars, and be able to sit at the feet or at the table or wherever the brush arbor, wherever you're going. It's allowing us to be able to have the space to be able to have these discussions in a way that's going to be meaningful and poignant. And so long as you tell us that we can't do that, then it makes it difficult for us to be able to engage in conversation. If you limit the ability of the scholar to reach the public about this critical information, then then you limit our ability to be able to have these discussions so that they can be able to understand it, so that we're not just preaching to the choir, or not everybody is in a work or in a way to be able to just take their article and turn it into something for USA Today or anything like that. We have to have conversations. So allow us to have the conversations and listen openly.
Anybody else want to?
I kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Anderson was saying. I think that, it also will add to, so as someone who teaches a survey U.S. history course, right? My students are uncomfortable when I tell them and I ask them about, when I have them think about Thomas Jefferson and his relationship to Sally Hemings, right? The fact that she's a 15-year-old, the idea of consent. He owns her. And could she say no? Could an enslaved woman say no to her owner? And so what does, and I teach predominantly white students. And so the fact that, and then so in my evaluations, they're like, well, you talk too much about race. She's just, oh, you're so obsessed about race. And I'm just like, why don't you talk about World War II? I'm like, so you want to talk about World War II? You want to talk about the rape? And I mean, there's like, just, what do you, like, what? So when we have these conversations and when you introduce students to the truth of quote unquote our founding fathers and the demystifying of who they really were as human beings, right? I'm not saying that there wasn't anything positive that came out of George Washington's leadership in regards to his military tactics in extending out the Revolutionary War to get independence from Great Britain. Because what he did was extend the line. The British couldn't hold it. He knew that he had to have time and kept running and running. That's how America would get its independence. However, he's also someone who wore dentures from human teeth, from his enslaved individuals. So human beings are complicated. And if you understand the history, the complete history, no one's trying to make it like, because I saw a clip where this woman was like, my daughter is ashamed of being white. Well, who told her to do that? No one said you should be ashamed of being white. We're just telling you what white people did in America. Because, I mean, Black people in Africa sold other Africans. And so there's a whole thing there. But, we're talking about the history of America. So that's I think that giving them that truth is, and exposing them to it early, will help them so that when they come to college and they come to my classroom, they won't be so completely thrown off guard when they learn about these specifics in regards to their quote unquote founding fathers and the truth about them.
Well, let me ask this question to kind of go along with the previous question and the next question that I would ask as well too, because I'm looking, questions are coming in now. I'm telling you, thank you for your questions, and thank you again, viewers, for really engaging into this conversation. We're going to try to get to all the questions, but when we talk, you have explained what critical race theory is. You talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, you talk about Derek Bell, you talk about starting in the legal profession, in law schools and stuff like this. But when we hear politicians talk about critical race theory, they are not using that. They are saying other stuff. So to tag on to what we have already talked about, and Daniel, maybe you can get us kicked off. How does critical race theory complement or contradict the truth, as one viewer is asking, that America is just a country constantly striving to be a more perfect union with liberty and justice for all, but at the same time, the politicians are not, let's just say, proclaiming the truth around critical race theory when they talk about it?
So I don't know that this is going to be a satisfactory answer, but it does kind of piggyback on what Dr. Donaldson was saying, and I think that a way to reach people is to emphasize that both things can be true, right? It can both be true that Thomas Jefferson wrote some great theoretical things about liberty and equality and justice, and even fought for those things, and that Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder with this relationship, if you call it a relationship, with Sally Hemings. Those things can both be true, and we don't have to be afraid of that. And so, when as this topic has come up recently, and I'm going to try to be responsive, Andre.
No, go ahead.
The way that I've thought about it has been about that it is being used today as as a target in what I would describe as a silencing. And so in some ways it is, for me, free speech doctrine that is first to mind. And the idea that the way to counter speech that we dislike, disapprove of, disagree with, cannot be in a nation that protects free speech, cannot be silencing, but instead has to be counter speech. And so what, and when I say counter speech is, prove me wrong. That's in fact what critical race theory is, right? There is a narrative of American law and American history, and critical race theory is counter speech to that. And so the response, the sort of current response that counter speech can't be overcome with sort of coming back at it, but instead has to be silenced. That just seems to me as inconsistent with our ideals of tolerance and our ideals of freedom, and freedom of speech in particular in the First Amendment.
Wow, great. Anybody else want to add a little bit to that, or you want to go on to the next question, because we have several here? Dr. Anderson, I think this is directed to you about racial linguistics. The viewer was very pleased with your theoretical explanation. The viewer also wants to know, how does that work? Offer an example, and this is from a former German teacher. So
if we're looking at it from the foreign language classroom, one of the things that I explain to people is, and I guess we've got some current stuff happening right now. If we think about In the Heights and how phenomenal that was as a musical movie, but what we don't see is the normalization of the Black bodies that are present in Latin America. So what ends up happening is we have this phenomenal way of being able to teach and instruct in foreign languages, but we do not include the diversity that is absolutely present there in order for the Black child to be able to see that diversity is everywhere. It makes it, I speak personally, I didn't even know that there were Black Colombians until after grad school, when I went to the country myself. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to see ourselves in everything. We spend a lot of time doing it in STEM. We do it in English. We do it in math, making sure that we know all about where there are folks that look like us in these subject areas, but we don't do it in foreign language because the assumption is its language culture is already is a given, and it's not. And from a racial linguistic perspective, it's being able to acknowledge not only that those bodies are there, but those bodies have also influenced the language. That the word for yam in English and in Spanish is very much African derived, and being able to have those conversations around that. So that would be probably the best example I can give as in a concise nature.
Thank you.
Can I pick it back?
Sure.
So to build off of what Dr. Anderson was saying, because I'm so happy she brought that up, when you think about the demographics in regards to where people of African descent went, I think that this is where, once again, if we understand the importance of the historization of the transatlantic slave trade, right? in the building and helping them students to understand diaspora, right? The fact that the majority of people who were enslaved went to Brazil, right? That the largest country, Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa. So that, you know, you will see, if you go to Brazil and you're a Black person, you'll see a lot more people who look like you than if you go to Argentina, right? And, you know, you will, it's important, or like Colombia or Venezuela, those countries have huge numbers of people of African descent. And so when you say, for example, right now, if you're watching the Copa America and you look at on Fox Sports and you see, you're like, why does Peru have or Bolivia have all those Black people? Wait a minute, there's some dark skinned folks. I didn't know that. And you're like, well, if you understand that actually only about 500,000 people of African descent of Africans went to the US, and the majority went to South and Central America. And so people don't understand that, or that there are Afro-Mexicans, and that Juneteenth has been celebrated in Mexico since the creation of Juneteenth. But, you know, all of that is going to be left out if you constantly try to present this idea of colorblindness. And I'm like, but America isn't colorblind and has never been colorblind. And until people really accept that, then, you know, I kind of put it like that. I tell my students, well, I try to say this. America likes to think that they're the Jedi. They like to think they're the rebel warriors in the Star Wars analogy. But they're really Darth Vader and they're really, you know, the bad guys. And the indigenous Americans and Black, they're the rebels. And, you know, white people, like the oppressive whites who, Robert Taney and all them, they're Darth Vader and the Emperor Lord Sith. So anyway, that's how I kind of put that in. All right, I'm going to stop being an
Right. And I think to that end too, and I apologize for jumping in. I think to that end, if we're thinking in terms of, especially in the foreign language classroom, if we're doing stuff like teaching salsa and teaching merengue and teaching rumba and teaching all of that stuff and not talking about the African history that is associated with that, it is absolutely out of order. To be able to have these conversations and make it seem as though this is just something that just came from the white sky and fell into this country is absolutely inappropriate, because it silences the whole rich history of these different countries. If you talk about salsa not being a part of the African plantations in Latin America, if you talk about merengue not being a part of that communal aspect when it comes to the plantation experience within Latin America, you limit the student in terms of what they understand. There's a reason why salsa has the beats it does. There's a reason why merengue has the beats it does. And if we're not allowed to teach that, the children will never know that.
Wow. We are having such a rich conversation. I know it is 7 o'clock Central Standard Time, but we still have a few more questions. So if the panelists are okay, I would love to just push on maybe for another 10, maybe 15 minutes. Is that okay? Can I just please ask for a little bit more time? Thank you. Thank you very much, panelists. You're so great. And let us just make mention that we are doing this Facebook Live event with the help of Nathan Ball, who is our assistant media coordinator, along with our administrative coordinator, Megan Cullen. And thank you for being a part of this. Megan is the one that's sharing the questions with me. And of course, Brother Ball here is running the Zoom room for us. So we are so thankful for that. And we thank you for allowing us to go just about 10 minutes. Dr. Baxter, I want to go ahead on and talk. There is a question about, since you brought up you teaching CRT in church, and you brought up the religious component of this, talking about white evangelicals and how they are presenting critical race theory. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us and then try to frame it within the context in which you're operating out of?
Well, there's a lot to unpack. I could go on for days, but yeah, there's definitely been a I guess you would call it spotlight placed on the white evangelical movement. We can call it that, and it is something that tends to challenge all that critical race theory is about. We talk about these narratives, right, and freedom of speech, and Daniel saying that, you know, this idea that you have this narrative and then you have this counter narrative for speech and counter speech and on, and white evangelicalism in its present iteration seems to be, for lack of a better term, hell bent on countering anything that is not white, is not conservative, is not their brand of Jesus and Christianity, which I say their brand because there's this book that came out years ago entitled American Jesus, right? And it talks about how in America we have successfully created a new Jesus, an American Jesus. You know, everything that's American made is better. And so we even made our own Jesus. And that it's this idea that white evangelicals actually are worshiping that Jesus, this American-made Jesus that really is not in any way connected from a morally and ethically based platform to that brother from Palestine. So it's a very unique thing. And so what we see play out today is this idea that because there's this idea to counter everything that does not look like this Jesus that has been manufactured, then what is taught, what is preached, what is professed ends up being really in the way I see it, a basically a bastardization of Christianity, and it really strips Christianity of its roots, which is much darker than what we see. And so today it's very unique, very interesting, robust conversation in the church community, and one that is necessary. And I believe, you know, critical race theory is a way of entering these conversations and having them very, very meaningfully. And so, yeah, I think that's important. I think it's very important. That's a major question, a great question.
Well, listen, we are up against time right now. This has been such a wonderful conversation. We promise we have to do a part 2. Can we do a part 2? We're gonna try to make that work. We're gonna have to do a part 2. We still got questions in the chat. The panelists, if you would not mind, if you can go on to the Ben Hooks page and you see maybe some questions, or if you want to engage with some people on our page, please feel free to do so. There's one question in here about a reading list. We want to put up some links, if you would not mind, panelists, put up some links that we would then place in a blog post so people can go to. We will hyperlink them so you can go to the works themselves. And we want to continue this dialogue. This was real good, and I thank all of you for being a part of this. People are still making comments and asking questions and thanking us for having this conversation. And this is what we wanted to try to do, to try to unpack, to demystify, if you will, critical race theory, to ground it into what it is, and then try to explain how it works in real life. And I'm so glad that we said a couple of things that that hopefully demystified a lot of thinking out there. And one of the things is that we kept saying over and over again that, guess what? Elementary school children and K through 12 are not learning critical race theory. So then the question is, then why the legislation? And so maybe in part two, we can kind of unpack some of that as well too. But thank you again, panelists, Dr. Donaldson, Dr. Anderson, Attorney Keel, and Dr. Baxter. I want to thank our executive director, Daphne McFerrin, for giving us space and place to do this wonderful panel. I want to thank again Nathan Ball and Megan Cullen for their work, not only behind the scenes, but in front and on side, and helping us stay the straight and narrow. And I also want to remind everybody to go to our website, Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change. You can just Google it, it'll pop up, and go to our website, check us out. Please follow us on Facebook. You're on there now, just click the follow, go to our YouTube page, subscribe to that. This will be up a little bit later on the YouTube page as well. And then, of course, go to Twitter, Hooks Institute, at Hooks Institute. Follow us there as well, too. Listen, this has been wonderful. This has been great. I am Dr. Andre Johnson. I am the scholar in residence right here at the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change. I am also Associate Professor of Communication, Rhetoric, and Media Studies right here at the University of Memphis. And we will be back. I think we're going to do a part two. So we will let you know that date and time as well, too. But until next time, go in peace. Thank you for joining.